Have you ever looked at a list of the world's richest people, glanced down at your own paycheck and just wondered, how does the math actually work here? Well, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really fascinating economic paradox. We're going to be looking at some recent economic analysis, along with some deep historical data, to unpack the growing global disparity in taxation between average earners and the ultra-wealthy. We're going to cover the mechanics of how this happens, look at the historical precedents of wealth taxation, and explore the intense geopolitical pressures that our sources suggest might soon force a massive shift in how democracies fund their futures.
So let's kick things off with a number that I think perfectly captures this entire paradox: $1,800. According to public tax records from 2011, Amazon founder Jeff Bezos legally claimed an $1,800 child tax credit. Now, why? Because on paper, his taxable income was actually low enough to qualify for financial assistance. But meanwhile, in reality, his wealth that exact same year grew by an estimated $18 billion. It's completely legal, and honestly, it's a brilliant move on his accountant's part. But the source material highlights how this exposes a massive structural gap in how wealth is recognized by the state versus how everyday income is recognized.
All right, Section 1, the tax paradox.
Let's put this into perspective with a side-by-side reality check using Italy as a prime example of what is really a global trend across Western democracies. If you're a typical worker earning a decent salary, doing the daily grind, you could be handing over up to 43% in marginal income tax. But an investor, someone trading stocks from their couch, they pay a flat 26% capital gains tax. There's no progressive scaling based on how much they actually make. It's just a flat rate. So the worker is being taxed on their daily labor at nearly double the rate the investors taxed on their capital. It's kind of wild to think about, but this is literally the foundation of the modern tax code.
And get this, that disparity, it gets passed down through generations. Just 4%. That's the number. If you're leaving an estate over €1 million to direct relatives in Italy, the inheritance tax rate is a mere 4%. That is astoundingly low when you compare it to the massive 40 or 45% hits you'd see in places like the UK or France. The data here suggests that massive concentrations of wealth can be transferred almost entirely intact. It's a huge contrast to the burden placed on the everyday labor that actually keeps the broader economy moving.
Moving on to Section 2, the mechanics of wealth.
Okay, so high net worth folks don't just rely on baseline capital gains rates. They have access to highly specialized legal toolkits. The analysis we're looking at highlights 3 specific maneuvers used a lot in Italy. First, you have carried interest. This lets private equity managers essentially disguise their performance bonuses, which is literally their work compensation, as capital gains, instantly slashing their tax rate. Then you have asset revaluation windows. These let investors pay a tiny substitute fee, usually around 14%, to just wipe out decades of accumulated tax debt. Poof, gone. And finally, tax-neutral share exchanges let them shuffle corporate assets around without triggering a single tax bill. These are incredibly powerful tools, completely unavailable to someone living on a standard salary. But the real crown jewel of wealth management, that would be the holding company, thanks to something called the participation exemption. Here's how it works. If a billionaire's operating company pays out a massive dividend, it doesn't go to their personal bank account where it would get heavily taxed. No, it goes to their holding company. And because of the participation exemption, 95% of those dividends are entirely exempt from taxation. So the holding company is effectively paying only a 5% tax rate on that massive cash flow. That money can then legally be used to fund yachts, real estate, private jets, the whole shebang, all while the individual's personal taxable income stays remarkably low.
So, when the dust settles, the final math is staggering. Data from the Bank of Italy and Bocconi University reveals a total structural inversion. When you account for the actual economic wealth being generated, the average citizen pays an effective rate of around 47%. Meanwhile, the top 0.1% pays an effective rate of only 36%. To put that simply, the absolute wealthiest among us are actively paying a smaller true percentage of their economic growth than the middle class.
Which brings us to Section 3, the history of taxation. Now, you might be wondering, has it always been this way? Actually, no. Looking at 2 centuries of tax data across 20 democracies, researchers Kenneth Shave and David Stasevich found something fascinating. The one thing that pushes top tax rates over 50% isn't rising inequality. It isn't left-wing politics, it's war. Specifically, mass mobilization for war. Look at 1939. Only 7% of Americans even paid income tax. But by 1944, right at the height of World War II, 66% paid it, and the top marginal rate hit an astonishing 88%. We saw the exact same pattern in 1947 when post-war Italy implemented a progressive wealth tax that hit 61%. Economists actually have a name for this. It's called compensatory taxation, a theory coined by Edwin Seligman way back in 1911. And the logic is pretty straightforward. If the working class is being asked to sacrifice their actual physical lives on the battlefield to save the country, well, the wealthy are asked to sacrifice their capital to ensure the nation survives and rebuilds. Post-war leaders used exactly this rationale to completely rebuild infrastructure. But today, mass conscription is largely a thing of the past, and that has essentially removed the traditional historical trigger that previously justified high wealth taxes.
Let's dive into Section 4, the impossible Trinity.
Today, democracies are trapped in a framework that Edward Fishman calls the impossible Trinity. Basically, we want three things: economic interdependence with the world, internal security at home, and to win geopolitical competitions against rival nations. But here's the catch. The rule of the Trinity is you can only pick two. Right now, by choosing deep global interdependence and fierce geopolitical competition, the source argues we have essentially sacrificed our internal security. The result? Fragile supply chains, wild inflation, and democracies that feel highly vulnerable to outside shocks.
To regain that internal security, Western nations need massive funding. We're talking huge investments for domestic industrial revitalization, defense spending, and the energy transition. But where does that money come from? The source outlines three really stark choices. Option 1, borrow more money. But countries like Italy already sit at a precarious 135% debt-to-GDP ratio. Option 2, deeply cut healthcare and pensions. Obviously, that is absolute political suicide for any elected leader. Or Option 3, find new revenue streams by finally taxing the ultra-wealthy. Economically, governments are being backed into a corner where door number 3 is looking like the only mathematically viable option left on the table.
Which leads us to our final section, Section 5, the proposed solutions.
One very prominent fix comes from economist Gabriel Zucman, and honestly, it's surprisingly modest. Just 2%. That's it. He advocates for a global minimum wealth tax of 2% on fortunes exceeding 100 million euros. Now, the fascinating part of this is the actual goal. It's not designed to radically redistribute wealth or to punish success. Mathematically, billionaire wealth already grows by about 10% annually, so a 2% tax simply stabilizes the concentration of wealth. It just ensures the gap doesn't continue widening infinitely.
Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Won't billionaires just pack up and move their money to Switzerland or Dubai? Well, not anymore. Since 2018, over 100 countries have quietly adopted the Common Reporting Standard. This forces automatic banking data exchanges globally. Your home country knows exactly what is sitting in that offshore trust. Because of this new transparency, a wealth exit tax is now completely, technically feasible. A nation could legally tax a departing billionaire's wealth for a decade, justifying it as repayment for the state infrastructure, the education, and the legal systems that allowed them to build that wealth in the first place.
Critics often argue, sure, it's technically feasible, but governments will never have the guts to actually seize or heavily tax offshore wealth. But look at what happened in February 2022. Following the invasion of Ukraine, Western nations completely froze $300 billion of Russian central bank assets sitting in European and American accounts. And they did it in just 48 hours. This proves a critical point from the source. When push comes to shove and a collective trauma hits, financial systems that seem totally untouchable can be restructured almost overnight. The mechanisms to track and hold massive capital already exist.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought. As former financial executive Morris Pearl warns, structurally imbalanced systems always, eventually rebalance themselves. The only question is how. Historically, they rebalance through progressive, careful legislation, or they rebalance through sudden societal breakdown and conflict. The data, the historical precedents, and the geopolitical pressures are all aligning. So the question we have to leave you with today is this: will democratic systems proactively fix these tax imbalances using the tools they already have, or will they wait until a collective geopolitical trauma forces their hand? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating paradox with us. Keep questioning the systems around you, and we'll catch you in the next explainer.